Hi guys! Tonight we drift into something strangely familiar yet distant. A quiet exploration of why your mind, right now as you lie in bed, still carries echoes of a world filled with firelight, stone tools, and open night skies. Outside your window there is modern silence, maybe a distant hum of traffic or the soft flicker of a streetlight. But inside your thoughts, something older seems to stir. It is as if your mind remembers a time it has never personally seen. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And feel free to comment where you are watching from, and what time it is for you right now. Dim the lights. You settle deeper into your space, perhaps pulling a blanket closer, while imagining that your brain is not entirely a product of the modern world. In fact, much of what you're about to explore begins with a simple but profound idea from anthropology and neuroscience. The human brain, as we know it today, is largely shaped by evolutionary pressures from the Pleistocene epoch, a period stretching from about 2.6 million years ago to roughly 11,700 years ago. During this time, early humans and their relatives lived in small groups, moving across landscapes that were unpredictable, often cold, and filled with both opportunity and risk. One mainstream historical fact is that anatomically modern humans, Homo sapiens, have existed for around 300,000 years. Yet agriculture only began roughly 12,000 years ago. That means for most of our cognitive development, humans were not farmers, city dwellers, or office workers, but instead mobile foragers navigating forests, grasslands, and coastal regions. Your brain, in many ways, was tuned during that long stretch of survival-focused living. You might find yourself imagining that world now. As the room around you grows quieter, a faint creak in the house could almost feel like movement in tall grass. A shadow near the corner of your vision might once have been something worth immediate attention. It is not that you're in danger now, of course, but your mind sometimes behaves as if it still needs to be ready. Anthropologists often describe early human life as deeply interconnected with environment. There was no clear separation between nature and daily existence. Weather dictated movement. Seasons determined food availability, and even sleep patterns followed the rhythm of firelight and darkness rather than clocks. A quirky historical detail often mentioned in studies of prehistoric life is the widespread use of ochre pigment. Early humans crushed red and yellow minerals into powder, sometimes using them for body decoration, cave markings, or symbolic expression. It is oddly intimate to think that long before written language, humans were already leaving behind colour as a form of communication. You can almost picture that now, a quiet cave illuminated by flickering fire, walls slowly filling with handprints and animal shapes. Somewhere in that scene, a mind not so different from yours is trying to make sense of the world through patterns, survival, and memory. Researchers continue to question how much of modern human behaviour is truly new versus how much is an adaptation of these older survival systems. Some scientists suggest that the brain is highly flexible and continuously reshaped by culture, while others argue that core emotional and cognitive responses remain deeply rooted in prehistoric survival needs. This debate is ongoing, and it gently reframes the way you think about everyday thoughts, reactions, and instincts. As you breathe slowly, you may notice how easily your attention shifts. A sound outside the room feels slightly more significant than it should. A moment of violence feels heavier than expected. These responses are not random. They are part of a system that once had to decide quickly whether rustling in the dark meant wind, animal, or human presence. In prehistoric environments, such sensitivity was not optional, it was essential. Missing a real threat could have consequences, while a false alarm cost little more than a burst of adrenaline. Over time, natural selection favoured minds that leaned toward caution, even when certainty was low, and so, even now, in a safe and controlled environment. Your brain sometimes prefers to assume rather than ignore. You might find it interesting that early humans likely spent significant portions of their day scanning their surroundings, not in anxiety as we define it today, but as a natural rhythm of awareness. This constant environmental reading shaped attention itself. Modern neuroscience shows that the brain still prioritizes novelty and potential threat, directing focus toward anything that breaks pattern or expectation. Some scholars suggest that this ancient attentional system explains why modern life can feel mentally tiring. Others disagree, arguing that cognitive fatigue is more related to information overload in contemporary environments. The discussion remains open, and it continues to shape how we understand stress, attention, and mental rest. Now, as you rest here, imagine that your thoughts are slowly sinking with a much older rhythm. Not the rhythm of notifications or schedules, but something simpler. Breath, silence, flickering mental images that drift in and out like firelight on cave walls. There is something calming in realizing that your mind was once shaped for a world without constant urgency. A world where waiting was normal, and where stillness had meaning. And even though your life now is very different, that older structure still lingers beneath everything you do. You settle a little more deeply, as if your body remembers how to rest in a way that does not require explanation. And for a moment, it is enough just to be here, with that ancient mind quietly present beneath the surface of modern thought. You remain in that quiet, drifting space, where the past does not feel far away anymore, but gently layered beneath the present. Now, as your body rests in a modern bed, soft fabric supporting you, a pillow shaped for comfort, you begin to notice something subtle. Your surroundings are peaceful, controlled, even predictable, and yet your mind does not fully belong here, at least not in the way your environment does. You are safe, your room is stable, the temperature can be adjusted with a touch, and still, the deeper systems inside your mind are operating on older instructions, written long before comfort became normal. One mainstream historical fact is that Homo sapiens began spreading out of Africa roughly 60,000 to 70,000 years ago, gradually populating Eurasia, Australia, and eventually the Americas over thousands of generations. This was not a sudden migration, but a slow movement shaped by climate shifts, resource availability, and survival pressures. Your brain, in many ways, evolved during and before this long journey, adapting to environments where uncertainty was constant and stability was rare. So as you lie here, your modern bed almost becomes an interesting contrast point. Soft mattress, controlled lighting, quiet walls. To an early human mind, this level of consistency would have been unusual, even suspicious. In prehistoric environments, stillness could mean safety, but it could also mean hidden danger. Your mind still carries that old ambiguity, even when logic tells you otherwise. You might notice how your thoughts drift between comfort and alertness. A passing sound outside the room may briefly pull your attention, even if you know it is nothing important. This is not a flaw, it is a deeply embedded survival feature, designed for a world where ignoring the wrong signal could have serious consequences. A quirky historical detail often mentioned by archaeologists is that early humans likely had very different sleep patterns compared to modern expectations. Evidence from historical accounts and anthropological studies of pre-industrial societies suggests that segmented sleep, sometimes called biphasic sleep, may have been common. People would sleep for a few hours, wake for a period during the night, and then sleep again until dawn. During the waking interval, they might talk, reflect, or tend small fires. The night was not always a single uninterrupted block of rest as it is for many people today. You can almost imagine that quiet interval, a dim fire glowing in a sheltered space, people softly awake, listening to night sounds outside, no artificial light, no screens, just the rhythm of breathing and the occasional crackle of wood. In that space, Wakefulness was not necessarily discomfort. It was part of the natural night cycle. Scholars remain divided on whether segmented sleep was truly universal in prehistoric times, or whether it emerged more prominently in later pre-industrial societies. Some researchers suggest it was a widespread human pattern before industrial lighting changed sleep behavior. Others argue that sleep has always been flexible, shaped more by environment than by a single fixed structure. The debate continues, and it quietly reshapes how we think about what normal sleep actually means. As you rest now, your own sleep may feel slightly different when you think about it this way. Not as a strict requirement to fall unconscious for hours, but as a rhythm your body naturally follows, influenced by light, safety, and habit. Your bed remains still, the room remains calm, and yet your mind continues to simulate older environments and soft background layers. In those environments, survival depended on reading subtle cues, a shift in wind direction, a distant animal call, the absence of familiar night sounds. All of these could matter. Even today, your brain does not fully discard that sensitivity. It simply repurposes it. Instead of forests and predators, it scans for modern equivalents, tone of voice, sudden changes, unexpected silence. The context has changed, but the underlying system remains familiar. And perhaps that is why modern rest can sometimes feel strangely incomplete, not because anything is wrong, but because your internal design was never originally meant for environments this stable for this long. You adjust slightly in bed. The blanket feels heavier now, or perhaps just more noticeable. Your breathing slows without effort, as if your body recognizes that no immediate decisions are required. Still, part of your mind continues its quiet ancient habit of observation in prehistoric life. This kind of layered awareness would have been useful even during rest. Early humans likely slept in groups, with some level of shared vigilance. Not everyone slept deeply at the same time. Someone, somewhere, was often lightly aware of the surroundings. This distributed attention increased group survival chances. Now, of course, you do not need that system in the same way, but it remains part of the architecture beneath your thoughts. Researchers continue to debate how much of human sleep architecture is biologically fixed versus culturally shaped. Some argue that core sleep cycles are deeply embedded in mammalian evolution, while others suggest that human sleep is unusually adaptable and strongly influenced by environment and behavior. The question remains open, and it reflects a broader mystery about how much of what you feel is ancient and how much is learned. As you continue lying here, the boundary between those ideas softens. Ancient and modern do not feel separate anymore. They overlap gently, like layers of sound fading into one another. The room is quiet. Your body is still, and somewhere beneath both, a much older rhythm continues to exist, steady and patient, asking for nothing, simply remaining. You continue drifting in that quiet space between wakefulness and sleep, where thoughts no longer feel linear, but instead move like slow water through older landscapes of the mind. There is a gentle sense now that your awareness is not only observing the present moment, but also brushing against something much larger, something shaped over millions of years in gradual, almost imperceptible steps. Before anything else, it helps to understand the background of that slow transformation. Human evolution did not happen in sudden leaps. It unfolded across vast stretches of time, where small changes accumulated generation after generation. Early ancestors such as Homo erectus lived between about 1.9 million and 110,000 years ago, gradually developing larger brains, more complex tools, and greater adaptability to changing environments. Later species like Neanderthals coexisted with early Homo sapiens, each adapting in their own ways to Ice Age conditions, shifting climates, and resource uncertainty. One mainstream historical fact is that the human brain tripled in size over the course of evolutionary history. but much of that growth happened long before agriculture or civilization. The most significant expansions occurred in response to survival challenges like hunting coordination, social cooperation, and environmental unpredictability. Your mind, right now, is the outcome of that extremely long process, shaped more by survival than by comfort, more by uncertainty than by stability. As you lie here, it becomes easier to imagine how slow that process truly was. No single generation noticed a dramatic change. Instead, each one inherited a slightly refined version of the mind before it. A little more capacity for memory, a slightly improved ability to recognize patterns, a growing sensitivity to social cues, especially within small groups where cooperation could mean survival. And yet, even with all that time, the underlying architecture of your brain still carries echoes of those early conditions. It was never redesigned from scratch, it was refined, adjusted, and layered upon, like a structure built slowly over an ancient foundation that remains visible beneath modern walls. A quirky historical detail often discussed by archaeologists involves ancient chewing habits. Evidence shows that prehistoric humans sometimes chewed on natural materials like birch bark, not just for nutrition, but also as a form of adhesive processing or even early medicinal use. In fact, traces of birch pitch, a tar-like substance, have been found with human bite marks dating back tens of thousands of years. It is sometimes described as a kind of prehistoric chewing gum, though its purpose was far more practical than modern gum. It might have been used to soften materials for tool-making or to treat minor discomforts. You might find it strangely grounding to imagine that simple action, a human sitting quietly near a fire, chewing on a piece of tree resin, not thinking in abstract terms, but focused on immediate sensations, survival tasks, and small daily needs. Life was not divided into categories like work and rest in the way it often is today. It was continuous, shaped by environment and necessity. Now, in contrast, you're here in a controlled environment, where most survival pressures are distant or abstract. Food is stored, temperature is regulated, danger is largely conceptual rather than immediate, and yet your brain still operates on a design that expects variability, scarcity, and social interdependence at a very intimate scale. This mismatch is subtle, but it influences how you think, how you feel, and even how you rest. Scholars remain divided on how quickly cognitive evolution can respond to changes in environment. Some researchers suggest that the human brain is still slowly adapting to modern conditions, especially in urban environments that are dramatically different from ancestral habitats. Others argue that evolution works too slowly to account for recent changes, meaning that most modern mental experiences are still shaped by ancient conditions rather than new ones. This ongoing debate highlights how difficult it is to separate what is truly new in the human experience from what is inherited. As you continue resting, you might notice how your thoughts drift more easily when you think in this way, not because the ideas are complex, but because they feel expansive. Time stretches outward. The present moment becomes less like a point and more like a long continuum that you are gently resting inside. In early human environments, adaptation was not just physical, it was deeply social. Groups of early humans depended on shared knowledge, cooperative hunting, and collective memory. A single individual's awareness was not enough for survival. The group itself functioned as a distributed mind, where each person contributed observation, skill, and memory to the whole. That is why your brain today is still highly sensitive to social context. Tone of voice, facial expression, and subtle shifts in behavior remain deeply important to your perception, even when survival is no longer directly at stake. These sensitivities were shaped in environments where misunderstanding another person could have real consequences for access to food, safety, or belonging. You settle a little deeper, and the idea of evolution begins to feel less like a distant scientific concept and more like a quiet undercurrent beneath your everyday thoughts. It is not something you need to actively think about. It is something you're already living within. There is also something calming in realizing that nothing about your mental experience is random, even confusion, even restlessness. Even moments of quiet alertness have roots in systems designed for survival in very different conditions. They are not flaws, they are remnants of adaptation, still present because they once mattered greatly. A gentle modern comparison might help here. Today, you might adjust a phone setting or update software to improve performance. But evolution does not work through updates in that way. It works through accumulation, inheritance, and slow adjustment over vast periods of time. So instead of clean versions or clear transitions, you get layers of history still active beneath the surface. Some researchers continue to question whether certain aspects of human cognition, such as language complexity or abstract reasoning, emerged gradually or appeared in relatively rapid bursts during key evolutionary periods. Others suggest that these abilities were always developing slowly but became visible only when cultural artifacts like art and language began to preserve evidence of them. The discussion remains open, and it reflects how much of human history is still partially understood. As you remain here, breathing steadily, it becomes easier to sense that you are not separate from that long history. You are one continuation of it, a moment where ancient patterns are still active, still shaping perception, still guiding attention in quiet ways. The room around you stays calm. The world outside continues without urgency, and beneath it all, there is a very old process still unfolding, not loudly, not dramatically, but steadily, like something that has always been there and will continue long after this moment passes. You keep resting in that soft in-between state, where the edges of your thoughts feel less defined and the past seems to drift closer without any effort. It is almost as if your mind is walking slowly backward through time, not to escape the present, but to understand why the present feels the way it does. Now you begin to enter a different mental landscape entirely, one shaped by hunter-gatherer life, before agriculture, before permanent settlements, before anything resembling modern routine. Humans lived in small mobile groups that followed food sources across wide territories. Your brain, still operating on ancient instruction, was formed in that world of movement, attention, and constant environmental reading. One widely accepted historical fact is that for the vast majority of human existence, people survived as hunter-gatherers rather than farmers or city dwellers. Agriculture only emerged around 12,000 years ago, a tiny fraction of the time Homo sapiens has existed. That means your cognitive systems, your instincts, your emotional responses were shaped primarily in environments where survival depended on tracking animals, identifying edible plants, and maintaining close social bonds within small groups. As you imagine that world, it is not dramatic or cinematic. It is quiet, continuous, and deeply attentive. You might picture yourself walking through open grasslands or sparse woodland, where every sound carries meaning. The wind shifts slightly through tall grasses, birds call in the distance. The ground beneath your feet is uneven, familiar only through repeated travel. In that kind of world, attention is not optional, it is constant. Your senses remain lightly open at all times, not in fear, but in readiness. A rustle in the bushes might mean movement worth noticing. A broken branch might indicate passage of animals. A change in smell on the wind could signal rain or distant fire. A lesser-known anthropological observation is that many hunter-gatherer societies practiced what researchers sometimes call delayed consumption. Instead of immediately eating food upon discovery, groups often carried it back to shared spaces, where distribution happens socially rather than individually. This behavior reinforced group cohesion and reduced conflict, ensuring that resources supported the entire band rather than just one person. You can almost feel that structure now, not as a rule, but as a rhythm. Life is not segmented into private and public in the modern sense. Instead, survival is shared, movement is shared, awareness is shared, even rest is shared in cycles, with some individuals lightly awake while others sleep more deeply. As you settle further into this idea, you may notice how different it feels from modern isolation. Today, you can be physically safe but socially distant, surrounded by walls rather than people. In the hunter-gatherer world, separation from the group would have been unusual and potentially dangerous. Your brain still carries that deep expectation of belonging, even when your environment does not always reflect it. That is why social signals feel so important to you now. A message left unread, a tone that feels slightly different than expected, a brief silence in conversation. These small cues activate systems that once monitored group harmony for survival purposes. An interesting detail often mentioned in archaeological studies is the use of personal ornamentation among early human groups. Items such as shells, carved bones, or threaded beads have been found in sites dating back tens of thousands of years. These objects were not necessary for survival in a physical sense, yet they likely played a role in identity recognition and group belonging. In a world without written names or formal documents, appearance and shared symbols helped maintain social structure. It is strangely intimate to think about that. A small shell carried from a river, not because this is useful in the modern sense, but because it represents connection. Someone else in the group recognizes it, communicates memory, belonging, perhaps even shared experience. You might notice how your mind naturally softens when thinking in this way. The hunter-gatherer world was not simple, but it was direct. Needs were immediate. Feedback from the environment was clear. There was less separation between action and consequence, less abstraction layered between decision and outcome. Some researchers suggest that this directness shaped modern human intuition, giving rise to quick decision-making and strong pattern recognition. Others argue that what we call intuition is actually a combination of learned experience and evolved cognitive shortcuts that were useful in unpredictable environments. The discussion remains open, and it continues to influence how psychology interprets instinctive thought today. As you remain here, gently observing these ideas, you might start to feel how your mind still prefers certain types of thinking. Clear cause and effect, immediate relevance, tangible outcomes. These preferences are not accidental. They reflect long periods of adaptation where abstract reasoning was less important than fast interpretation of real-world signals. You might also notice how your attention drifts toward human presence in imagined scenes. Faces, voices, subtle movements. This is because in small groups, understanding others was often more important than understanding the environment itself. Predicting behavior, sensing mood, and maintaining cooperation were all essential survival skills. In that sense, your brain is not just a thinking tool, it is a social instrument, tuned for interaction, cooperation, and awareness of others within a limited group size. Even now, there is a natural comfort in familiar voices, predictable routines, and small circles of trust. As you lie here, breathing slowly, you can almost imagine walking alongside such a group, no fixed destination in the modern sense. Just movement guided by seasons, resources, and shared knowledge. The sky above changes slowly, the ground beneath shifts with time, and life is measured not in schedules, but in cycles of availability and rest. A subtle comparison might help you feel this contrast today. You might check a calendar to understand your day. In that earlier world, the environment itself was the calendar. Animal migrations, plant cycles, rainfall patterns, and daylight length provided all necessary structure. Your mind still responds strongly to natural rhythms like light and darkness, even though artificial systems now overlay them. That is why evenings can feel so naturally calming. Your body recognizes the transition without needing an explanation. The lowering light signals a long-inherited pattern of rest preparation. Even here, in a modern space, that older rhythm still whispers quietly through your awareness. Scholarly perspectives differ on how much of modern behavior can be directly traced to hunter-gatherer adaptations versus more recent cultural development. Some researchers emphasize deep continuity, suggesting that much of human psychology remains anchored in prehistoric life. Others highlight the adaptability of the human mind, arguing that culture has significantly reshaped cognition in relatively short periods. This ongoing discussion continues to refine how we understand the boundary between instinct and learning. And as you think about that boundary, it becomes less sharp. You're not divided between ancient and modern systems. You're a blend of both, with older patterns still active beneath newer layers of experience. The room around you remains still, your body remains supported, and somewhere beneath thought itself, there is a steady awareness that does not need language, does not need explanation, only continuation. You stay in that slow drifting awareness, where thoughts no longer feel like separate ideas but like soft movements through a long, continuous landscape. The earlier world you are walking through begins to shift now. It becomes less about gathering and movement, and more about something deeper, something more primal that still quietly shapes the way you react even in complete safety, fear. Not the sharp kind that arrives suddenly, but the quiet background sensitivity that never fully turns off. Before anything else, it helps to understand the environment that shaped it. In the late Pleistocene epoch, early humans lived alongside large predators across Africa, Europe, and parts of Asia. This included animals such as cave lions, saber-toothed cats, giant hyenas, and massive bears in certain regions. These creatures were not constant threats in every moment, but their presence shaped behavior, movement patterns, and even sleep locations over thousands of generations. One widely established historical fact is that early human survival was deeply influenced by predator avoidance strategies, including group sleeping, elevated awareness during rest, and rapid interpretation of environmental cues. Even when direct encounters were rare, the cost of ignoring danger was extremely high, which meant the brain evolved to prioritize early detection over perfect accuracy. So as you lie here now, in a completely safe environment, your mind still carries systems designed for that world. A sudden sound in another room, a shift in light outside your window, even a small unexpected sensation in your body. These do not trigger fear in a dramatic way, but they do activate a subtle orientation response, as if the brain briefly checks whether attention is needed. You might notice how quickly the mind can move from rest to alertness and then back again. It happens almost automatically, without deliberate thought. This is not a malfunction. It is an ancient protective mechanism that once helped early humans survive in landscapes where silence did not always mean safety. A lesser-known anthropological observation is that many prehistoric and early historic communities showed evidence of what researchers sometimes describe as protective spatial behavior. Archaeological findings suggest that groups often chose sleeping arrangements based on environmental awareness, such as proximity to fire, cave entrances, or natural barriers in some sites. Repeated patterns of sleeping placement indicate that certain positions were preferred for visibility or perceived safety, even if the exact reasoning cannot be fully reconstructed. It is easy to imagine that now, a fire burning low in the center of a small group, people lying close together, not in discomfort, but in shared awareness. The darkness beyond the firelight is not empty. It is full of unknowns, and the mind, even at rest, remains lightly engaged with those edges. You might find it interesting that modern neuroscience identifies something called threat detection bias. This refers to the brain's tendency to prioritize potentially negative or dangerous stimuli over neutral or positive ones. In practical terms, it means your attention is naturally drawn more quickly to things that could indicate risk, even if those things are harmless in reality. Some cognitive scientists propose that this bias is a direct continuation of survival systems shaped in environments where missing a real threat could have severe consequences. Other researchers counter that while the bias may have evolutionary origins, its intensity today is strongly shaped by modern stressors, media exposure, and learned patterns of attention. The discussion is ongoing, and it highlights how ancient systems interact with very modern environments. As you rest here, you can gently observe how this plays out in a subtle way. A faint noise might briefly feel meaningful before your rational mind reclassifies it as ordinary. A moment of silence might feel slightly too quiet before it settles again into normal background calm. These micro shifts are part of the same system that once scanned forests and grasslands for movement. There is also a fascinating detail often mentioned in evolutionary psychology discussions. Humans appear to have an unusually strong sensitivity to facial expression and tone of voice compared to many other species. Even slight changes in expression can be detected quickly and interpreted emotionally. This likely developed in small group environments where maintaining social harmony and detecting shifts in intention were important for survival. You can imagine how this would have mattered in prehistoric settings. Knowing whether someone in your group was calm, tense, or uncertain could influence decisions about movement, hunting, or rest over time. This sensitivity became deeply embedded in how your brain processes social information. Now, in your quiet modern space, this same system continues to operate. You might notice it in everyday moments, such as when someone pauses slightly longer before speaking, or when a message feels subtly different in tone than expected. These are small echoes of a much older skill set, still active beneath conscious thought. A quirky detail often mentioned in archaeological literature involves ancient responses to animal remains and natural markers in the landscape. Evidence from certain prehistoric sites suggests that humans sometimes avoided or carefully navigated areas associated with large predator activity, such as bones, tracks, or scent markers, while interpretation varies. It is believed that these environmental cues played a role in shaping movement routes and settlement choices over long periods of time. It is strangely grounding to think that awareness of such details once mattered deeply. A broken branch near a path, a disturbed patch of earth, the faint sound of movement beyond sight. These were not abstract concerns, they were part of daily awareness, woven into every step, and even now, your mind has not fully let go of that habit, it simply applies it differently. You might notice that modern fear rarely comes from the immediate physical danger, yet the internal sensation can feel surprisingly similar. Anticipation, uncertainty, sudden alertness. These are remnants of systems designed for real, tangible threats, now often activated by symbolic or psychological triggers instead. Other anthropologists suggest that fear responses in humans have broadened over time, becoming less tied to direct survival threats and more influenced by complex social and cognitive factors. This perspective emphasizes how flexible the human fear system has become, adapting to environments far removed from those in which it originally evolved. As you continue to rest, it becomes easier to see fear not as something foreign, but as something deeply familiar, almost like a protective layer that rarely needs to fully activate anymore. Most of the time, it exists only as background readiness, quietly ensuring that attention can sharpen if needed. The room around you remains unchanged. There is no urgency here, no hidden movement, no need for scanning beyond what comfort allows. And yet somewhere beneath that comfort, a very old system continues its gentle work, not to disturb you, not to alarm you, but simply to remain available, like an ancient watchfulness that has not yet been told it can fully rest. You feel your breathing slow again, almost in response to that realization, as if the mind, recognizing safety, allows itself to soften just a little more. And in that softness, the ancient world feels slightly further away, though still quietly present beneath everything. You continue to drift in that quiet, suspended awareness, where time feels less like something measured and more like something gently unfolding around you. The sense of fear from the previous moments does not disappear, but it fades into the background, like a distant echo that no longer demands attention. In its place, something else begins to emerge, something softer, but just as deeply rooted in your evolutionary past. Desire, craving, the quiet pull toward energy. Before civilization, before agriculture, before storage or abundance, food was not guaranteed. It came in cycles, in uncertainty, in moments of discovery followed by long stretches of scarcity. Your brain, shaped in that environment, learned to treat energy not as something always available, but as something to prioritize whenever it appeared. One widely accepted historical fact is that early human diets were highly variable and depended heavily on geography and season. In many regions, prehistoric humans consumed a combination of wild plants, fruits, nuts, tubers, insects, and occasionally hunted meat. There was no single stable menu. Instead, survival depended on flexibility and opportunistic gathering. So as you rest here, your modern experience of food becomes an interesting contrast. You might have access to a refrigerator, a pantry, or delivery services that bring food with minimal effort. Yet inside your mind, the same ancient systems that once responded to rare calorie-rich opportunities are still active. You may notice how certain foods feel more appealing than others, especially those high in sugar, fat, or salt. This is not accidental. These nutrients were rare and highly valuable in prehistoric environments, signaling energy density and survival advantage. Your brain developed reward systems to encourage seeking them whenever possible. A lesser-known anthropological detail is that early humans often relied heavily on what researchers call fallback foods. These were food sources that were less preferred but consistently available during difficult seasons. Examples included roots, bark, fibrous plants, and tough vegetation that required significant effort to process. While not ideal, these foods provided stability when more desirable options were scarce. You can almost imagine that now. A small group moving through a changing landscape, scanning for fruit trees during one season, digging for tubers in another, adjusting constantly to environmental rhythm. Food was not a fixed category, it was something discovered, earned, and shared. In that world, noticing food quickly could mean survival. Missing an opportunity could mean waiting days or longer for another chance. That is why your modern brain still reacts strongly to food-related cues. Smells, visuals, even memories of taste can activate attention more quickly than many other stimuli. Some researchers continue to debate whether human preference for calorie-dense foods is purely evolutionary or whether cultural reinforcement plays a larger role in shaping modern eating behavior. Others suggest that while culture influences habits, the foundational preferences are deeply biological and remain consistent across populations. The discussion remains active, reflecting how closely biology and environment are intertwined. As you lie here, you might gently notice how thoughts of comfort foods carry a sense of warmth or ease, not urgency, but familiarity, as if your mind recognizes these patterns as rewarding in a way that feels older than language itself. There is also an interesting detail often mentioned in studies of ancient nutrition. Evidence from isotopic analysis of prehistoric remains suggests that some early human groups experienced periods of significant dietary change depending on climate fluctuations. During colder periods, diets may have become more reliant on animal protein and fat, while warmer periods allowed for more plant-based variety. This adaptability was one of the key strengths of human survival. You might find it calming to think of that adaptability now. Your body and mind are not fixed systems. They respond to environment, opportunity, and change. Even your cravings are not random, they are signals shaped by long histories of necessity. And yet, in the modern world, those signals often arrive without the same context. You're rarely in true scarcity, but the internal system does not always distinguish between physical need and learned expectation. This is part of why desire can sometimes feel stronger than logic. A quirky historical observation often discussed in archaeology is the presence of ancient food processing tools, such as grinding stones and mortars, found in early settlement sites. These tools indicate that even before formal agriculture, humans were already investing significant effort into preparing food, making it more digestible and increasing nutritional access. It suggests that food preparation has been central to human life far longer than farming itself. You can imagine the slow rhythm of that process. Stone against stone, seeds being crushed, roots being softened. The repetitive motion, not rushed, but steady. Part of daily survival rather than separate from it. Modern life. In contrast, often removes that direct connection. Food arrives in packaged forms, already processed, already prepared. Yet your brain still reacts as if acquisition required effort. Because for most of the evolutionary history, it did. Scholars remain divided on how much modern craving patterns are influenced by ancient biology versus recent environmental abundance and marketing systems. Some argue that evolutionary drives are the dominant force, while others emphasize the role of modern food environments in amplifying natural preferences. The conversation continues, especially in nutritional science and behavioral psychology. As you rest here, you might notice how desire itself begins to soften when it is simply observed. It does not disappear, but it becomes quieter, less demanding, almost like a wave that rises and then gently settles back into stillness. In prehistoric environments, this relationship with desire was immediate and practical. You either had food or you did not. There was less room for abstract craving disconnected from action. Today, however, desire can exist independently of immediate need, sustained by memory, imagination, and availability. That difference is subtle but important. It means your mind can simulate scarcity even in abundance. It can generate motivation without necessity. And while this is useful in some contexts, it can also create a sense of tension that did not exist in the same way for early humans. You remain here, breathing gently, and you might notice how your body begins to relax as the tension shifts away from those cycles of wanting. The room feels steady again. The present moment feels sufficient without needing anything more. And beneath that calm, the ancient systems continue their quiet background work, not urging, not demanding, only maintaining the patterns that once kept life going across unpredictable landscapes. You continue drifting in that soft, weightless awareness, where thoughts no longer feel like structured sentences, but more like slow-moving impressions passing through a very old part of your mind. The focus now shifts gently again, away from fear and desire, towards something even more fundamental, something that shaped every moment of survival in prehistoric life without ever needing to be consciously understood. Belonging, not as an abstract idea, but as a biological necessity. Before written language, before formal rules, before any modern systems of identity, humans lived in small interdependent groups where survival depended on cooperation. Being part of the group was not just emotionally comforting, it was essential for physical survival. Alone, the chances of surviving long periods in prehistoric environments dropped significantly. Together, those chances increased dramatically. One well-established historical fact is that early human groups were typically small, often ranging from around 20 to 50 individuals. Though estimates vary depending on the environment and period, these groups were tightly connected, with relationships built over years of shared movement, shared food, and shared protection. Within such a structure, every individual mattered in practical ways. contributing to daily survival tasks. So as you lie here, it becomes easier to feel how deeply that ancient need for connection still exists within you. Even now, in a safe and modern environment, your mind remains sensitive to signals of acceptance, inclusion, and social harmony. A delayed reply, a shift in tone, a moment of distance in conversation can feel disproportionately meaningful because your brain still interprets social belonging as a survival factor. You might notice how naturally your attention returns to human presence, even in memory or imagination. Voices feel grounding. Familiar patterns of interaction feel calming. This is not coincidence. It reflects a system shaped over vast periods where social cohesion directly influenced survival outcomes. A lesser-known anthropological observation is that many early human remains and archaeological sites show strong evidence of care for injured or elderly individuals. Skeletons with healed fractures or long-term disabilities suggest that others within the group provided support over extended periods. This implies that cooperation and empathy were not late developments, but deeply rooted aspects of human behavior. It is strangely moving to imagine that a person unable to hunt or move efficiently still remaining within the group, supported by others who share food and protection. In such moments, survival is no longer individual, it becomes collective. In your modern setting, this same system continues to operate, though in more subtle forms. It appears in friendships, families, online communities, and even brief interactions with strangers. Your mind is constantly reading social context, evaluating safety not just in physical terms, but in relational terms as well. Some researchers describe this as the social brain hypothesis, the idea that human intelligence evolved largely to manage complex social relationships. According to this view, cognitive abilities such as memory, communication, and emotional interpretation develop primarily to maintain group cohesion rather than purely to solve environmental problems. Other scholars propose that while social factors are undeniably important, environmental challenges such as tool use, foraging strategies, and spatial navigation also played major roles in shaping cognitive evolution. The discussion remains open, reflecting the complexity of human development across multiple overlapping pressures. As you rest here, you might notice how much of your internal experience is shaped by imagined social awareness. Even when alone, the mind often simulates presence. Conversations replay in memory. Future interactions are rehearsed in thought. This reflects how deeply social processing is embedded in cognition. There is also an interesting detail often mentioned in archaeological interpretations of early habitation sites. Evidence of shared sleeping areas suggests that early humans frequently rested in close proximity, likely for warmth, protection, and social bonding. Fire pits surrounded by clustered remains of sleeping arrangements indicate that nighttime was often a collective experience rather than an isolated one. You can almost feel that scene forming gently in your imagination. A low fire glowing at the center, bodies resting nearby, soft sounds of breathing, occasional movement as someone shifts position or checks the surrounding darkness. The environment is quiet, but not disconnected. Awareness is shared, even in rest. Modern life, by contrast, often allows for solitude in ways that would be rare in prehistoric conditions. You can be physically alone without immediate consequence. Yet the brain still carries expectations shaped by millions of years of group dependence. Scholars continue to debate whether human emotional sensitivity to social rejection is primarily a direct evolutionary adaptation, or whether it has been significantly shaped by cultural reinforcement over time. Some suggest that the intensity of social emotions in modern settings may exceed what was necessary in ancestral environments, while others argue that strong social sensitivity was always crucial for maintaining group stability. The discussion continues across psychology and anthropology. As you remain here, the idea of belonging begins to feel less like a concept and more like a background condition of the mind. Not something you actively think about, but something that quietly influences how safe you feel, even in silence. A quirky detail often noted in studies of early symbolic behaviour is the use of repetitive group rituals, such as rhythmic movement, shared chants, or coordinated tasks. These activities may have helped strengthen social bonds and reinforce group identity. While interpretations vary, many researchers believe such behaviours contributed to emotional cohesion within early communities. You might imagine that rhythm now, not as something loud or dramatic, but as something steady and calming. Movement shared, attention aligned, a sense of being part of something larger than any single individual. In your present moment, that need is still there, though expressed differently. It might appear in small preferences for familiarity, in the comfort of routine, or in the subtle ease that comes from feeling understood, and as you breathe slowly. You may begin to notice that belonging does not require effort in this moment. It is already partially satisfied by simply being here, in a calm space, with no demand for action or performance. The room remains quiet. Your body remains supported, and beneath it all, the ancient architecture of social connection continues its steady presence, gently shaping how you experience even the simplest moments of stillness. You drift even deeper now, as if the earlier ideas of fear, desire, and belonging are slowly settling into the background, becoming part of a larger pattern rather than separate themes. Your awareness softens further, and the mind begins to shift its focus towards something quieter, something that operates almost invisibly in everyday life, yet was absolutely vital in prehistoric survival. Constant vigilance, not panic, not stress, just a steady, low-level awareness of the environment that never fully turned off. Before anything else, it helps to imagine the world that required this. Prehistoric landscapes were not static or predictable. Weather changed quickly. Food sources shifted across seasons. Other human groups could be allies or competitors depending on context. And large animals moved through territories without warning. In such an environment, complete relaxation was rarely safe for long periods. One widely supported historical fact is that early human survival depended heavily on environmental awareness skills such as tracking, pattern recognition, and rapid interpretation of subtle changes in the landscape. These abilities were not specialized tasks for a few individuals, but shared cognitive tools used by nearly everyone in the group. So as you lie here, your modern mind still carries a faint version of that system. Even in total safety, there is a part of you that gently monitors your surroundings, a sound in another room, a shift in airflow, a small change in light. These are processed automatically, often below conscious awareness. You might notice how your attention occasionally drifts outward, even while you are trying to rest inward. This is not distraction in the usual sense. It is a deeply rooted scanning behavior that once helped maintain survival in unpredictable environments. A lesser-known archaeological observation comes from the study of ancient habitation sites, where researchers have found evidence of repeated spatial organization in living areas. Items such as tools, hearths, and sleeping spaces often appear in consistent arrangements across different sites and time periods. This suggests that early humans may have developed habitual ways of organizing space to improve awareness and efficiency, possibly keeping certain areas clear for movement or observation. It is easy to imagine that quiet structure now. A fire placed centrally, tools arranged nearby, sleeping areas positioned in ways that allow quick awareness of movement, nothing chaotic, but nothing overly rigid either, just enough order to support both rest and readiness. Modern life rarely requires this kind of continuous environmental reading, yet the underlying system remains active. Your brain still evaluates novelty, movement, and unexpected changes in your surroundings, even when those changes are harmless. This is part of why sudden sounds can briefly interrupt relaxation before being dismissed as irrelevant. Some researchers refer to this as ambient vigilance, a baseline level of attentional readiness that remains present even during rest. It is thought to be a remnant of survival systems that once needed to remain partially active at all times. Other scholars suggest that this state is not purely evolutionary, but also influenced by modern overstimulation, where frequent alerts and notifications train the mind to remain partially alert throughout the day. The discussion is ongoing, and both perspectives contribute to understanding the phenomenon. As you continue resting, you may begin to notice how this vigilance softens when there is nothing demanding it. It does not disappear, but it relaxes, like a hand slowly unclenching when it realizes there is nothing to hold. A quirky detail often mentioned in studies of ancient sensory adaptation involves the human ability to detect subtle motion in peripheral vision. This ability is particularly strong compared to many other species, and likely played an important role in detecting movement in dense or low visibility environments. Even today, your peripheral awareness can pick up motion before your focused attention fully registers it. You might gently notice that now, the sense that you are aware of more than you are actively thinking about. The room is still, yet your mind holds a soft map of its space, not in detail, but in feeling. In prehistoric conditions, this kind of distributed awareness would have been essential. Focusing too narrowly for too long could mean missing important environmental changes. So the mind evolved to balance focus with openness, allowing attention to shift fluidly between detail and surroundings. That balance still exists within you now, found when you're deeply focused on a thought. Part of your awareness remains lightly open to everything else. Scholars remain divided on how much of this vigilance system is purely inherited from early human evolution versus how much is shaped by later environmental demands such as urban living, artificial light, and constant sensory input. Some argue that modern environments amplify baseline alertness, while others maintain that the system itself has changed very little over time. The question continues to be explored across neuroscience and evolutionary psychology. As you rest here, it becomes easier to sense this vigilance not as tension, but as background structure, something that exists beneath thought, not interfering unless needed. You might imagine early humans resting in a similar way, never fully disconnected from their surroundings, yet still able to achieve deep rest in safe conditions, firelight flickering, soft movement of others nearby, occasional sounds blending into the night, awareness present but not overwhelming, and in that imagined scene, there is a quiet similarity to your present moment. Not in danger, not in urgency, but in the presence of a mind that is always gently aware, even when it is resting. The room remains calm, your body remains supported, and that ancient layer of vigilance continues its quiet watch, not intruding, only existing, like a distant rhythm that no longer needs to speak loudly. You drift further now, and the feeling of the room around you becomes less defined, as if the edges of it are gently dissolving into something older and more universal. The mind begins to shift away from alertness, from belonging, from even the quiet vigilance that has followed you through so many imagined landscapes. What remains now is something even more fundamental to human existence: darkness, and how the brain learned to live within it. Before artificial lighting, before electricity, before even stable fire use became widespread. The night was not simply a time of reduced visibility, it was a completely different world, one where perception narrowed. Sounds became more significant, and imagination filled the gaps that vision could not reach. One well-established historical fact is that early human sleep patterns and nighttime behavior were shaped directly by the absence of artificial light. The natural cycle of sunset and sunrise structured daily life far more strictly than it does today. Darkness was not just environmental, it was behavioral, influencing when people moved, rested, gathered and remained still. So as you lie here, Your modern understanding of night as something safe and controlled begins to contrast gently with the ancient experience of it. You can turn on a light with ease, you can check your surroundings instantly, but your brain still carries deep memory systems shaped in environments where darkness meant reduced certainty and increased reliance on sound, touch, and group proximity. You might notice how nighttime still feels slightly different from daytime, even in modern life, not necessarily frightening, but quieter in a way that feels emotionally distinct. This is not just cultural habit. It is tied to long evolutionary patterns of reduced visibility and altered sensory dependence. A lesser-known anthropological detail involves the use of fire as a central organizing element in early human nighttime life. Archaeological evidence from hearth sites shows repeated patterns of fire maintenance in specific locations over extended periods. Fire was not only a source of warmth and cooking, but also a psychological anchor, a fixed point of visibility in an otherwise uncertain environment. It is easy to imagine that now, a small fire burning steadily in the center of a group, faces partially illuminated by flickering light. The surrounding darkness not fully absent, but held at a distance, conversation likely soft, movement slow, attention partially shared between warmth and environment. In such conditions, darkness was never fully separate from awareness. It was something negotiated moment by moment, balanced by firelight and group presence. Modern neuroscience continues to explore how humans process darkness differently from light environments. Some researchers suggest that reduced visual input increases internal thought activity, allowing memory and imagination to become more prominent. Others argue that it simply shifts attention toward auditory and tactile processing. The discussion remains open, and both perspectives help explain why nighttime experiences often feel psychologically distinct. As you read here, you might notice how your own thoughts become slightly more fluid when imagining darkness. Images form without effort, memories drift more easily, the mind seems less anchored to external structure and more responsive to internal movement. A quirky historical observation often mentioned in studies of ancient environments is that some early human groups likely preferred sleeping near natural features that provided partial enclosure, such as rock formations, dense vegetation, or cave entrances. These locations offered a sense of boundary between safety and the unknown, even if the exact reasoning cannot be fully reconstructed. You can almost feel that instinct now, the preference for subtle enclosure, not complete confinement, but a sense that the space around you is gently defined. In modern terms, this might be compared to closing a door or drawing a curtain before sleep. Small actions that create psychological separation from the wider environment. Scholars remain divided on whether early humans experienced darkness primarily as threatening or whether familiarity eventually reduced its emotional intensity. Some suggest that repeated exposure to natural night environments may have normalized darkness over time, while others argue that caution likely remained a consistent background response due to predator activity and limited visibility. The evidence does not point to a single interpretation, but rather a spectrum of possible experiences. As you continue resting, you might begin to sense how your mind still adapts to changes in light even now. Dimness encourages slowing, darkness encourages inward attention, brightness encourages outward focus. These responses are subtle, but deeply consistent across human experience. There is also an interesting detail often highlighted in cognitive studies. Humans tend to produce more internally generated imagery during low-light conditions, a phenomenon sometimes associated with increased activity in memory-related brain networks. This may explain why nighttime thoughts often feel more reflective or emotionally textured. You might notice that now as your awareness becomes softer. Thoughts appear without urgency. They do not demand resolution. They simply arrive and fade, like shadows moving across a surface that is no longer fully defined. In prehistoric settings, this inward turn would have been balanced by group presence, firelight, and shared nighttime rhythms. In your current setting, it is experienced alone, yet the underlying mechanisms remain similar, and beneath it all, your brain continues its ancient adaptation to darkness, not as something to fear in this moment, but as a condition it has known far longer than artificial light has existed. The room around you stays quiet. The boundaries of the space feel steady and familiar, and somewhere deep within that stillness, the mind continues to remember how to be in the dark without needing to fully understand it. You drift even further now, and it feels as if the boundaries between your present room and the deeper past have softened into something fluid and continuous. The darkness you just imagined does not disappear. Instead, it transforms into something more structured in your mind, something tied to rhythm, warmth, and repetition. A sense begins to form that ancient human life was not only shaped by survival events, but also by cycles that quietly organized everything around them. Firelight and body clocks, before mechanical timekeeping, before watches, before even consistent artificial lighting. Human biology was far more directly shaped by environmental signals. The rising sun, the fading light, the presence or absence of fire, and seasonal changes all influenced when people were active, when they rested, and how their bodies regulated energy. One well-supported historical fact is that human circadian rhythms are biologically encoded and synchronized naturally with light and darkness cycles. Even today, in controlled modern environments, your body still releases hormones such as melatonin in response to reduced light, preparing the mind and body for sleep in ways that are deeply rooted in ancient environmental conditions. So as you lie here, your body is not simply reacting to your current bedroom, it is responding to a pattern far older than civilization itself, a pattern shaped by countless generations of humans who lived without artificial lighting, where the setting sun was not just visual information, but a biological signal. You might begin to notice how your energy naturally softens in low-light environments, not because you are choosing it consciously, but because your internal systems are adjusting automatically. This is one of the clearest examples of how prehistoric environments still influence modern experience. A lesser-known archaeological observation comes from studies of hearth-centered living spaces. In many ancient habitation sites, fire pits were not randomly placed. They often occupied central positions within dwellings or camps, suggesting that fire served multiple functions beyond warmth and cooking. It likely acted as a temporal anchor, organizing activity patterns throughout the day and night. It is easy to imagine that now, a fire slowly burning in the center of a group, people arranging themselves around it in loose patterns depending on activity, rest, or conversation. The fire is not just heat, it is timing, it is rhythm, it is a shared reference point for everyone present. In that environment, time was not divided into precise units, it was experienced through change, light increasing or decreasing, temperature shifting, human activity rising or slowing. Your modern sense of structured hours would have been completely absent, replaced instead by environmental cues that guided behavior in a more continuous way. Modern research into circadian biology shows that even small disruptions in light exposure can influence sleep quality, alertness, and mood. Some scientists suggest that this sensitivity is a direct inheritance from ancestral environments where light was one of the most reliable indicators of safety and activity timing. Others argue that while biology plays a strong role, modern habits and artificial lighting patterns amplify these effects significantly. The discussion remains active, especially in sleep science and chronobiology. As you rest here, you might notice how your awareness of time becomes less precise. It's no longer about minutes or schedules, it becomes more about sensation, heaviness in the body, softness in thought, the gradual slowing of internal movement. A quirky detail often mentioned in studies of prehistoric life involves the role of communal fire maintenance. Evidence suggests that in many early human groups, keeping the fire alive overnight may have been a shared responsibility, with individuals taking turns ensuring it did not extinguish. This practice would have required quiet coordination and trust, reinforcing both survival and social structure simultaneously. You can almost feel that quiet responsibility now, the soft glow of embers, someone gently adjusting wood, others resting nearby, aware but not fully awake. The night is not entirely passive, it is maintained. Scholars continue to examine whether early human sleep patterns were segmented or continuous, especially in relation to fire use and nighttime activity. Some interpretations suggest that sleep may have been naturally divided into phases, with periods of wakefulness used for reflection, conversation, or fire tending. Other perspectives argue that continuous sleep likely existed as well, depending on environmental safety and group structure. The evidence does not point to a single universal pattern, but rather a flexible range of behaviors shaped by context. As you continue drifting, your mind begins to mirror that flexibility. Thoughts do not move in straight lines, they pause, resume, dissolve, and return without effort. There is no urgency in their structure. There is also a fascinating detail from physiological studies of sleep. Human body temperature naturally drops during the night as part of the sleep cycle, a process closely linked to circadian regulation. This cooling effect helps signal rest to the body and is another mechanism that evolved in environments where temperature changes followed natural day-night cycles rather than controlled indoor systems. You might gently notice that sensation now, a subtle heaviness, a quiet settling, not discomfort, but transition, as if your body is following instructions written long before language existed. In prehistoric contexts, this kind of bodily rhythm would have aligned closely with environmental conditions. Nightfall meant cooling air, reduced activity, and increased stillness. Firelight provided localized warmth, but the broader environment encouraged rest. Some researchers continue to debate how sensitive early humans were to these environmental rhythms compared to modern populations. One view suggests that contemporary lifestyles have partially desynchronized natural circadian patterns, while another argues that core biological timing remains largely intact despite environmental change. The question remains open, but both perspectives agree that the underlying system is ancient and remarkably resilient. As you remain here, you may begin to sense how deeply embedded these cycles are within you, not as ideas, but as lived experience. Your body knows when to slow, your mind knows when to soften. Your awareness follows patterns that existed long before clocks defined time. The room around you remains still, the world outside continues without interruption, and within you, an older rhythm continues its quiet work, guiding rest in a way that does not require thought or effort. You continue sinking deeper into this quiet, drifting awareness, where the sense of time has almost completely loosened its grip. The idea of hours or minutes feels less relevant now. Instead, there is only a gradual unfolding of sensation, like layers of history gently settling over one another inside your mind. And beneath that softness, something else begins to surface again, something closely tied to how your brain remembers the world, memory, and why danger is never forgotten easily. Before anything else, it helps to understand that human memory did not evolve to record life evenly. It evolved selectively, shaped by the survival pressure. Experiences that carried emotional weight or survival relevance were more likely to be retained, while neutral moments often faded more quickly. This is not a flaw in design, but a functional adaptation from a time when remembering danger accurately could mean the difference between life and death. One well-documented historical fact is that emotional memory, especially fear-related memory, tends to be more strongly encoded in the brain due to the involvement of structures such as the amygdala. This system enhances recall for events that were intense, unexpected, or potentially threatening, ensuring that similar situations can be recognized in the future. So as you lie here now, your mind still carries that ancient prioritization system. A tense moment is remembered more vividly than a calm one. A negative experience can feel more persistent in thought than a neutral or positive one. This does not mean your mind is biased in a malfunctioning way. It reflects a long history of survival where remembering risk was more important than remembering routine. You might notice how easily certain memories rise compared to others, not because they are objectively more important, but because they were tagged by your brain as emotionally significant. This tagging system is deeply rooted in evolutionary biology and remains active even in completely safe environments. A lesser-known finding in cognitive anthropology is that oral storytelling traditions in early human society likely played a major role in reinforcing memory for important survival information. Stories about dangerous animals, successful hunts, or cautionary experiences were not just entertainment. They functioned as shared memory systems, transmitting survival knowledge across generations in a form that was easier to retain than abstract instruction. It is easy to imagine that now, a group gathered near a fire, listening to someone recount an encounter with a predator, or a difficult journey across unfamiliar terrain. The details are not recorded in writing, but in repetition, tone, and shared attention. The story becomes part of collective memory, shaping how future decisions are made. In that sense, memory was never purely individual, it was also communal. What one person experienced could become part of the group's behavioral guidance, passed along through narrative rather than documentation. Modern neuroscience continues to explore why negative or threatening experiences are often more easily recalled than neutral ones. One widely accepted explanation is that stress hormones such as adrenaline and cortisol enhance memory consolidation during emotionally intense events. However, researchers still discuss how much of this effect is universal biology versus shaped by the individual environment and culture. The conversation remains active, especially in studies of trauma and learning. As you continue resting, you might notice how your mind occasionally replays small moments from your past with unusual clarity, especially those that carried emotional weight. This is the same system at work, still functioning as it once did in environments where remembering a threat could prevent future harm. A quirky detail often mentioned in neuropsychology is that smell is one of the strongest triggers for involuntary memory recall. This is because olfactory pathways are closely connected to brain regions involved in emotion and memory processing. In prehistoric environments, scent would have been an important survival cue, signaling food, danger, fire, or nearby animals. You might gently notice how certain modern scents can suddenly transport you into memory without warning. A specific smell in a room, rain on dry ground, smoke in the air. These triggers bypass structured thought and go directly into emotional recall. Scholars remain divided on how much of human memory bias is purely evolutionary versus shaped by later cultural reinforcement. Some argue that survival selection alone explains the strong emotional weighting of memory. Others suggest that modern environments, education systems, and media exposure further amplify these natural tendencies. The discussion continues across neuroscience and psychology without a single definitive conclusion. As you lie here, it becomes easier to see memory not as a perfect archive, but as a living system that reshapes itself based on importance, emotion, and repetition. It does not store everything equally. It prioritizes what once mattered most for survival. There is also an interesting detail from archaeological interpretations of early human cognition. Evidence from symbolic artifacts suggests that some of the earliest forms of external memory may have included markings, carvings, and arranged objects used to represent events, counts, or meanings. These early systems likely supported internal memory by providing physical anchors in the environment. You can imagine a carved stone or marked surface not as writing in the modern sense, but as a reminder, a way of extending memory beyond the mind into the physical world. In your present moment, memory still functions in that layered way. Some of it is internal, Some of it is shaped by external cues, some of it fades, while other parts remain unexpectedly vivid. And as you continue resting, you may begin to notice how even memory itself begins to soften when there is no need to actively retrieve anything. Thoughts appear, then drift away again without urgency. The room remains quiet, your body remains still, and beneath it all, the ancient memory system continues its quiet work, preserving what once mattered most, even when the present also asks for nothing at all. You drift deeper still, and now the mind begins to feel less like something actively thinking, and more like something being gently carried. The earlier themes of memory begin to fade into the background, not because they are gone, but because they are no longer pressing for attention. In their place, another quiet layer of human experience begins to surface, something that feels familiar even in modern life, yet has roots stretching far back into prehistoric existence. Stress in a safe world before anything else. It helps to understand that stress is not originally a psychological concept. It is a biological response system designed to prepare the body for action. In prehistoric environments, this response was essential. It helped early humans react quickly to threats, whether that meant escaping danger, defending resources, or responding to tool change. One well-established historical fact is that the stress response involves a coordinated release of hormones such as adrenaline and cortisol, which increase alertness, sharpen attention, and prepare muscles for rapid action. This system evolved over millions of years and remains fundamentally unchanged in modern humans. So as you lie here now in complete physical safety, that same system still exists within you. It does not distinguish clearly between physical danger and psychological pressure. It responds to signals of uncertainty, urgency, or perceived threat, even when those signals are symbolic rather than immediate. You might notice how modern stress often feels different from ancient survival stress. It is less about immediate physical danger and more about anticipation, social evaluation, or abstract concern. Yet the internal sensation can feel surprisingly similar, because the same biological machinery is involved. A lesser-known observation from behavioral anthropology is that in small-scale early societies, stress was often short-lived and directly resolved by action. A threat appeared, it was addressed, and the body returned to baseline relatively quickly. There was less prolonged psychological activation compared to many modern experiences, where stressors can persist without immediate resolution. It's easy to imagine the contrast in a prehistoric setting. A sudden noise in the distance might trigger alertness, followed by investigation or group awareness. Once the situation was understood, the response would naturally settle. There was no lingering abstraction, no extended uncertainty stretching across hours or days in the same way modern concerns often do. Modern neuroscience continues to explore why the human stress system can remain activated even in the absence of physical danger. One widely discussed explanation is that the brain processes social and cognitive threats using the same pathways as physical threats, leading to prolonged activation when problems are unresolved. However, researchers continue to debate how much of this is biological inevitability versus environmental amplification caused by modern life complexity. As you rest here, you might begin to notice how stress in your own experience often comes in waves rather than constant intensity. A thought appears, a concern arises, a sensation of alertness briefly activates, and then slowly fades if no immediate action is required. This pattern reflects a system designed for responsiveness rather than continuous activation. A quirky detail often mentioned in physiology studies is that the stress response can be triggered even by imagined scenarios. The brain does not always distinguish clearly between real and vividly imagined situations, especially when emotional processing is involved. This means that anticipation alone can activate ancient survival pathways. You might gently recognize this in everyday life. Thinking about a future event can sometimes produce a physical sensation of tension, even though nothing is happening in the present moment. The body reacts as if preparation is needed. This reflects how deeply imagination and survival systems are connected. Scholars remain divided on whether chronic stress in modern populations is primarily a mismatch between ancient biology and contemporary environments, or whether it reflects an extension of adaptive systems responding to complex social structures. Some argue that modern life overstimulates a system designed for brief activation, while others suggest that the system itself has always been capable of extended engagement under certain conditions. The discussion continues across psychology, medicine, and evolutionary biology. As you continue lying here, you may notice how the very act of becoming aware of stress can sometimes soften its intensity. Not because it disappears immediately, but because it becomes observable rather than overwhelming. It shifts from being something you are inside of to something you are gently watching. In prehistoric contexts, stress responses were closely tied to immediate action and group coordination. If one individual detected a potential threat, others would respond quickly. This shared responsiveness helped distribute both awareness and workload across the group, reducing individual burden. A lesser-known archaeological insight comes from studies of ancient settlement layouts, which suggest that group living spaces were often arranged to allow quick visual or auditory communication. This would have supported coordinated responses during uncertain situations, reinforcing both safety and social cohesion. You can almost feel that structure now, not as architecture, but as a sense of shared awareness. People not isolated, but loosely connected by environment and proximity, able to respond together when needed. In your current moment, that same system still exists internally. Even if external conditions are very different, your body and mind are still designed for responsiveness, for quick adaptation, for alertness when required, but most of the time, that readiness remains in the background. And as you rest here, you might begin to feel that background soften again. Stress does not vanish entirely, but it loosens its grip, like something that no longer needs to be held tightly. The room remains calm, your breathing remains steady, and beneath it all, the ancient stress system continues its quiet readiness, not as an alarm, but as a possibility that no longer needs to be activated. You continue drifting in that soft, half-light state of awareness, where thoughts no longer feel separate from sensation, and even ideas about the past seem to blend into something gently continuous. The sense of stress from the previous layer does not vanish completely, but it recedes, like a tide pulling back from the shore, leaving behind something calmer and more structured underneath. Now the focus shifts to something that feels very ordinary in modern life, yet deeply mismatched with the environment your mind was shaped in. Cities, movement, and modern complexity. You walk through modern cities with an ancient brain before anything else. It helps to understand that cities are extremely recent in human history. For almost all of Homo sapiens' existence, humans lived in small, mobile groups, not dense permanent settlements filled with thousands or millions of people. The cognitive systems you carry were shaped long before roads, buildings, and constant social density became normal. One well-documented historical fact is that large urban centres only became widespread within the last several thousand years, beginning with early civilizations such as Mesopotamia, ancient Egypt, the Indus Valley, and later expanding across different regions of the world. Even then, for most of human history, population density remained far lower than what is common today. So as you imagine walking through a modern city now, something subtle becomes clear. Your brain is processing an environment it was not originally designed for. Movement in all directions, constant visual input, unfamiliar faces passing in rapid succession, sounds layered on top of each other without pause. You might notice how your attention behaves differently in such environments. It shifts quickly, it scans constantly, it tries to find patterns in what is essentially a high-density stream of information. This is not because something is wrong, but because your cognitive systems were shaped in environments where information was sparse, not overwhelming. A lesser-known anthropological observation is that early human groups likely had strong familiarity with every individual within their social circle. Recognition was immediate and continuous. In contrast, modern urban environments require the brain to repeatedly process unfamiliar faces, often without long-term social relevance, which creates a very different kind of cognitive load. It is interesting to imagine that contrast in a prehistoric setting. Most faces you see are known. In a modern city, most faces are unknown. Your brain, however, still treats facial recognition as an important survival skill, which is why it remains highly active even when social interaction is brief or indirect. A quirky detail often mentioned in studies of ancient cognition is that humans are particularly sensitive to directional movement in groups, in small bands. Noticing where others were going was essential for survival, whether following a herd, relocating camp, or responding to environmental change. This sensitivity still exists, which is why you may naturally track movement in crowds without consciously intending to. As you continue this mental walk through a city, you might begin to notice how noise affects your internal state. In prehistoric environments, sound was often meaningful or isolated. In cities, sound is continuous and layered, making it harder for the brain to determine what requires attention and what does not. Modern neuroscience suggests that urban environments can increase baseline cognitive load simply due to constant sensory input. However, researchers still debate how much of this effect is due to evolutionary mismatch versus learned adaptation to modern environments. Some argue that the brain gradually adjusts to high stimulation, while others suggest that certain aspects of overload remain fundamentally challenging regardless of experience. As you rest here, you might imagine your attention moving through a crowd like a gentle light, briefly touching different details before moving on. A passing conversation fragment, a distant vehicle sound, a flicker of movement at the edge of vision. None of it demands action, but all of it is still being processed in the background. There is also an interesting detail from environmental psychology. Studies have shown that humans often seek out visual patterns or areas of reduced complexity within dense environments, such as parks, open spaces, or quiet corners. This tendency is sometimes interpreted as a residual preference for landscapes more similar to ancestral environments, where visual input was less compressed and more expansive. You might recognize that instinct even in small ways. The desire to step aside from noise, the relief of finding a quieter space, the subtle comfort of fewer competing signals. Scholars remain divided on whether urban stress responses are primarily caused by sensory overload or whether social density plays a larger role in shaping cognitive fatigue. Some perspectives emphasize environmental stimulation, while others focus on interpersonal complexity and constant social evaluation. The discussion continues across multiple disciplines, including psychology, neuroscience, and urban studies. As you continue walking through this imagined city, the pace does not need to be fast. In fact, it feels more natural when it slows down. You're not trying to navigate or decide anything. You're simply observing how your mind responds to complexity it was never originally built to ignore completely. And yet, despite all of this input, your system still functions, it still filters, it still prioritizes, it still finds moments of calm within density. That in itself is remarkable. Because beneath the modern world, beneath all the noise and movement, there is still an older layer of cognition quietly doing what it has always done, trying to make sense of surroundings, trying to find patterns, trying to maintain balance between attention and rest. The city fades slightly in your awareness now, becoming less detailed, less pressing, and what remains is not the environment itself, but the feeling of moving through it with a mind shaped by a much older world. You continue drifting, and the imagined city slowly loosens its grip on your attention. The noise fades first, then the movement, and finally even the sense of scale begins to soften. What remains is not a place anymore, but a set of impressions, like echoes of complexity dissolving back into stillness. Now your awareness turns towards something quieter again, something that sits underneath modern experience but still carries the weight of ancient design, technology and old instincts. Before anything else, it helps to recognize that human tools did not begin with electronics or machinery. They began with simple extensions of the body and mind, stone shaped into cutting edges, wooden implements, bone tools. These early technologies were not separate from survival, they were survival. One widely accepted historical fact is that stone tool use dates back at least 2.6 million years, associated with early hominins such as Homo habilis and possibly even earlier ancestors. These tools marked a turning point in human evolution, where cognition and physical environment began to interact in increasingly complex ways. So as you exist in a modern world filled with digital systems, screens, notifications, and automated process, your brain is still fundamentally operating with expectations shaped by much simpler tools. Tools that require direct physical effort, clear cause and effect, and immediate feedback from the environment. You might notice this when interacting with technology. When something responds instantly, it feels natural. When it delays or behaves unpredictably, the mind often reacts with subtle tension or curiosity. This response is not just cultural conditioning. It reflects a cognitive system that evolved in environments where tools were extensions of direct physical action, not abstract layers of automated processes. A lesser-known archaeological observation involves the gradual refinement of stone tool industries over hundreds of thousands of years, from simple flakes to more sophisticated hand axes and later specialized tools. Each improvement reflects not only physical skill, but also increasingly complex planning abilities. These changes suggest that early human cognition was already capable of long-term thinking far earlier than modern civilization emerged. It is interesting to imagine that slow progression, no sudden invention of technology, but a continuous refinement of interaction between mind and material, each generation slightly improving upon the last, not through rapid innovation, but through accumulated experience. A quirky detail often mentioned in studies of early tool use is that some prehistoric tools appear to have been shaped not only for practical use, but also with symmetry and aesthetic consideration. While their primary function was survival, certain artifacts suggest that visual balance and form may have also mattered, even when efficiency alone would have been sufficient. This raises questions about whether early humans already experienced some form of aesthetic preference. As you went here, modern technology begins to feel less like a separate category and more like a continuation of that long trajectory. Your phone, your devices, your tools are still extensions of cognition, just far more abstract and layered than anything early humans could have encountered. Modern neuroscience suggests that the human brain is particularly sensitive to feedback loops, where action leads to immediate response. Digital systems often replicate this structure, which may explain why they feel so engaging. However, researchers still debate whether this engagement is primarily due to evolutionary compatibility with action-based environments or whether it is driven by learned associations developed in modern contexts. As you continue drifting, you might notice how your attention responds to responsiveness itself. Quick feedback feels satisfying. Delays feel like uncertainty, not because you are impatient, but because your cognitive architecture is tuned to environments where delay sometimes meant lack of information or missed opportunity. There is also an interesting detail from cognitive archaeology. Evidence from early symbolic artifacts suggests that humans gradually developed external systems for memory, planning, and communication long before writing systems emerged. Markings on bone, arranged objects, and repeated symbolic patterns may have functioned as early attempts to externalize thought processes. You can imagine that gently now, a mind trying to extend itself beyond the limits of internal memory, using physical objects as anchors for thought, not so different, in principle, from how modern humans use devices to store information, reminders, and communication. Scholars remain divided on whether technological development is best understood as a linear extension of cognitive evolution, or as a series of cultural leaps that periodically reshape how the brain interacts with its environment. Some emphasize continuity from early tool use to modern systems, while others highlight discontinuities introduced by rapid technological change. The discussion remains open across anthropology and cognitive science. As you rest here, the boundary between ancient tools and modern technology begins to blur. Both are expressions of the same underlying impulse: the desire to extend capability beyond the limits of the body alone. And yet, despite all this complexity, your mind still reacts in simple ways. It prefers clarity over confusion. It responds to feedback. It seeks patterns in systems. Whether those systems are made of stone, wood, or light on a screen, the modern world fades slightly in your awareness again, not because it disappears, but because it no longer feels separate from the deeper history underneath it and beneath that realization. There is a quiet sense that your mind has always been adapting, always extending, always trying to understand a world that keeps changing faster than its original design ever expected. You drift onward, and the sense of technology and ancient tools begins to fade behind you like distant lights seen through mist. The mind no longer feels as if it is moving through distinct topics. Instead, everything starts to merge into a single continuous thread, as if all human experience has always been variations of the same quiet pattern. Now something more subtle begins to rise in awareness again, something that does not belong to any specific time period, yet feels especially strong in the modern world you live in: scarcity in an age of plenty. Before anything else, it helps to understand that for most of human history, access to resources was unpredictable. Food, water, shelter materials, and even safety were not guaranteed. They depended on season, location, skill, and chance. The human brain evolved under these conditions, where preparing for absence was often more important than enjoying abundance. One widely established historical fact is that widespread food surplus only became common relatively recently in human history, beginning with the development of agriculture and later expanding significantly through the industrialization and global distribution systems. Even then, reliable abundance at the individual level is a very modern phenomenon, measured in decades rather than millennia. So as you rest here now, your surroundings may reflect stability and availability, yet your internal systems still carry the logic of older worlds. The mind does not automatically update its expectations based on modern infrastructure. Instead, it continues to anticipate fluctuation, just in case. You might notice this in small ways: a reluctance to waste, a subtle sense of urgency around opportunities, a tendency to think ahead about possible lack, even when there is no immediate sign of it. These patterns are not irrational. They are inherited strategies shaped in environments where resources could change quickly. In prehistoric settings, this kind of thinking would have been essential. Finding food one day did not guarantee finding food the next. Storage was limited. Preservation techniques were simple. Movement often depended on following availability rather than controlling it. A lesser-known detail from archaeological studies involves early evidence of seasonal foraging strategies. Human groups often adjusted their movement patterns based on predictable environmental cycles, returning to certain areas when resources were likely to be available again. This required long-term memory of landscapes and careful coordination within groups, reinforcing the importance of planning ahead even in uncertain conditions. You can almost imagine that slow rhythm now: a group moving through familiar terrain, not rushing, but constantly aware of what might be coming next. A place that was abundant one season might be empty the next. Nothing remains guaranteed. In contrast, modern environments often present the illusion of constant availability. Food is present in stores. Information is available instantly. Goods can be accessed with minimal delay. Yet despite this, the internal sense of scarcity does not fully disappear, it simply shifts focus. You might notice how the mind sometimes treats opportunities as if they are limited, even when they are not. This can appear in simple decisions, like hesitation to use resources, or in more abstract ways, like concern about missing out on experiences or choices. The underlying system is still operating as if scarcity could return at any moment. A quirky observation often mentioned in studies of human behavior is that people tend to assign higher value to items perceived as rare or limited, even when identical alternatives are available. This tendency appears across cultures and seems deeply rooted in cognitive processing rather than learned preference alone. It likely reflects ancient decision-making strategies where rarity often correlated with survival importance. As you continue resting, you may notice how this perception of value influences attention itself. The mind naturally highlights what feels limited, important, or at risk of being lost. This is not only about material resources, but also about time, attention, and even emotional experiences. Modern psychology continues to explore why humans often experience psychological scarcity, even in conditions of material abundance. One perspective suggests that this arises from an evolutionary mismatch, where ancient survival mechanisms operate in environments that no longer require them in the same way. Another perspective argues that modern complexity introduces new forms of scarcity, particularly in attention, time, and social connection. The discussion remains open, and both views contribute to understanding the phenomenon. As you lie here, the idea of scarcity begins to feel less like an external condition and more like a background lens through which the mind evaluates experience. Not constant anxiety, but subtle weighting of importance. Some things feel more urgent simply because the system was designed to prioritize them. There is also an interesting detail from economic anthropology. In many early societies, value is not fixed in abstract currency but tied directly to utility, effort, and immediate need. Exchange systems, where they existed, often reflected social relationships and situational context rather than standardized pricing. This means that value is more fluid, shaped by circumstance rather than constant measurement. You can imagine that fluidity now, a tool being more valuable in one moment than another, a resource becoming important only when conditions change. Nothing fixed in the way modern systems often assume. Researchers continues to question whether modern scarcity perception is primarily driven by internal cognitive architecture or reinforced by external systems such as advertising, economic structure, and digital comparison. Some argue that ancient survival mechanisms are being continuously activated by modern environments that simulate limitation through design. Others suggest that human cognition naturally constructs scarcity even in stable conditions, as a way of maintaining preparedness. The conversation is ongoing and complex. As you continue drifting, you might notice a gentle shift in how desire and scarcity interact. It is not just about wanting things, but about evaluating whether they might not always be available. That subtle uncertainty shapes attention more than the actual presence or absence of resources. In prehistoric environments, this system would have been highly adaptive. Overestimating scarcity was safer than underestimating it. It encouraged gathering, storing, and planning when possible. Those tendencies are still present, even when they are no longer strictly necessary for survival. And yet, in this quiet moment, nothing is actually lacking. There is no immediate need, no urgent demand. No instability requiring action. The system continues to run, but it is no longer being challenged. The room remains still, your breathing continues in a steady rhythm, and beneath the surface of thought, the ancient logic of scarcity remains present, not as pressure, but as a quiet habit of perception that once helped keep life going in uncertain worlds. You continue to drift, and the sense of scarcity begins to dissolve into something softer, as if your mind is no longer categorizing experience into lack or abundance, but simply observing the flow of thoughts as they rise and settle. The boundaries between ideas feel thinner now, and everything starts to connect in a quieter, more continuous way. Now the focus shifts again, this time towards something that feels deeply familiar in modern life, yet carries an ancient emotional weight beneath it. Anxiety as ancient protection, before anything else. It helps to understand that what we now call anxiety is closely related to the brain's threat anticipation systems. These systems evolved to help early humans prepare for possible danger before it fully appeared. In environments where threats were unpredictable, the ability to imagine potential outcomes was not a burden, but an advantage. One well-documented historical fact is that anticipatory stress-backed responses are mediated by overlapping neural systems involved in fear and planning. This means the same biological architecture that helps you think ahead is also capable of generating physical sensations of unease when uncertain outcomes are imagined. So as you rest here, your mind is still using that same system. It does not always wait for something to happen. It simulates possibilities, evaluates outcomes, and prepares the body accordingly in prehistoric environments. This would have increased survival chances by encouraging caution before real danger emerged. You might notice how modern anxiety often feels like it is attached to thoughts about the future rather than the present moment. This is because the system is fundamentally predictive. It is designed to scan ahead, not just react to what is already happening. A lesser-known observation from evolutionary psychology is that early humans likely benefited from what researchers sometimes call proactive worry. This meant mentally rehearsing possible threats, such as food shortages, environmental changes, or social conflict, before they occurred. While this could increase readiness, it also meant the system was always capable of producing internal tension even in the absence of immediate danger. It is easy to imagine that mental simulation now, a mind running through possible scenarios, not in a modern abstract sense, but as a practical survival rehearsal. What if the weather changes? What if food becomes scarce? What if the group moves without you? Each thought serving a functional role in preparedness. In your current environment, those same mechanisms are still active, but the threats they respond to are often symbolic or socially complex, rather than physical. Aims, expectations, uncertainty about outcomes, or imagined future situations can all activate the same internal systems. A quirky detail often mentioned in neurobehavioral studies is that the brain tends to treat vividly imagined scenarios as partially real in terms of emotional response. This is why simply thinking about a stressful event can produce physical sensations such as increased heart rate or muscle tension. The system is responding to the simulation, not just reality. You might gently recognize this in your own experience. A thought arises, and the body briefly responds before the mind reassures itself that no immediate action is required. This cycle reflects a system that evolved to prioritize readiness over comfort. Scholars continue to examine whether modern anxiety disorders represent an overactivation of ancient survival systems, or whether they are emergent phenomena created by uniquely modern environments that place constant cognitive demands on attention and prediction. Some perspectives emphasize evolutionary continuity, while others highlight the unprecedented complexity of modern social and informational life. The discussion remains active across clinical psychology and neuroscience. As you continue resting, it becomes easier to notice how anxiety is not a single feeling, but a layered process. There is anticipation, interpretation, bodily response, and then reflection. These layers often happen so quickly that they feel like one continuous experience. There is also an interesting detail from comparative anthropology. In many early societies, uncertainty was often managed collectively rather than individually. Group decision-making, shared observation, and communal planning helped distribute the cognitive load of anticipating future events. This may have reduced the intensity of individual anxiety by embedding it within social structures. You can almost feel that shared awareness now. Not isolation in thought, but a sense that attention and concern were once distributed across many minds, not concentrated in one. Modern research in cognitive science suggests that anxiety is closely linked to the brain's ability to simulate future outcomes. This ability is essential for planning and problem solving, but it also creates space for uncertainty to be emotionally experienced before anything actually occurs. However, researchers still debate how much of this is an unavoidable feature of predictive cognition versus how much is shaped by environmental reinforcement and learning. As you remain here, you might notice how the feeling of anxiety changes slightly when it's observed without urgency. It becomes less like a signal demanding action and more like a passing pattern of thought, briefly activated and then released. In prehistoric environments, this system would have been highly adaptive. Rapid preparation for potential threats increased survival probability over time. This created a brain that is highly sensitive to possibility, not just reality. And in the modern world, that same sensitivity continues to operate, even when the scale and nature of threats have changed significantly. The room around you remains steady. There is no immediate demand, no pressing need, no situation requiring response. Yet beneath that stillness, the predictive systems of the mind continue their quiet work, always preparing, always simulating, always ready. And as you drift further, even that readiness begins to soften, becoming just another layer in the long history of a mind that was built to imagine what might come next. You continue to drift, and the sense of anxiety that was present a moment ago begins to loosen its grip, not because it is pushed away, but because it is no longer being followed. Thoughts begin to lose their urgency. They appear, then fade, like faint ripples across a very still surface. Now your awareness shifts into something quieter and more abstract, something that has followed humanity since the earliest moments of imagination itself, dreams of ancient worlds, before anything else. It helps to understand that dreaming is one of the oldest and most universal human experiences. Every culture, every period of history, every known human society has reported dreams. While their interpretations vary widely, the experience itself appears to be deeply rooted in human biology. One widely accepted historical fact is that REM sleep, the phase most closely associated with vivid dreaming, is present in all healthy human adults and appears to play a role in memory processing, emotional regulation, and neural maintenance. This suggests that dreaming is not accidental, but a fundamental part of how the brain organizes experience. So as you rest here, your mind may gently begin to drift toward that same state, even if you are still aware of your surroundings. The boundary between thought and imagery can begin to soften. Dreams often draw from fragments of memory, emotion, and imagination, weaving them into experiences that feel real in the moment they occur. You might notice how dreams rarely follow strict logic. Instead, they move through association, emotion, and symbolic meaning. A place can shift without warning. A person can appear without explanation. Time can stretch or collapse. Yet within the dream, everything often feels coherent in its own way. A lesser-known finding in sleep research is that dreaming may help simulate scenarios that are not directly experienced in waking life. Some theories suggest that this simulation function could have supported survival by allowing the mind to rehearse responses to unfamiliar or challenging situations in a safe internal environment. It is easy to imagine that ancient connection now, a sleeping mind in a prehistoric setting, processing the events of the day, the sounds of the environment, the emotional tone of group interactions, not as entertainment, but as ongoing mental organization. In many early cultures, dreams were often considered meaningful messages or reflections of deeper reality, while interpretations differed. The importance of dreams as part of human experience was nearly universal. They were recorded, shared, and sometimes used to guide decisions or understand emotional states. A quirky detail often mentioned in anthropological literature is that some hunter-gatherer societies reported dreams as extensions of waking life. With less rigid separation between dream experience and physical reality compared to modern interpretations, in such contexts, dreams could be treated as additional information rather than purely internal experiences. You might gently notice how, even now, memories and imagination can blend slightly when you're in a relaxed state. A thought can briefly feel like a place, an image can feel like a memory. This is not confusion, but a natural feature of how the brain constructs experience during low arousal states. Scholars remain divided on the exact evolutionary purpose of dreaming. Some argue that it primarily supports memory consolidation and emotional processing. Others propose that it evolved as a form of threat simulation, allowing the brain to rehearse survival scenarios in a safe environment. A third perspective suggests that dreaming may be a byproduct of other neural processes. With no single adaptive function, the discussion continues across neuroscience and psychology. As you continue resting, you might notice how dreamlike thinking does not require sleep to begin. It can gently appear in the moments of relaxation. When attention is no longer tightly focused, images drift in and out, thoughts lose their structure. The mind becomes more associative than analytical. There is also an interesting detail from neurobiology. During REM sleep, the brain shows high levels of activity in regions associated with emotion and imagery, while areas responsible for logical regulation are less active. This combination may help explain why dreams feel vivid but often illogical, emotionally rich but structurally fluid. You might imagine that process now as a kind of internal storytelling, not directed by intention, but by the natural movement of neural activity, scenes forming, dissolving, reforming again without effort. In prehistoric contexts, this internal world would have been shaped by immediate experience. Animal sounds heard during the day, social interactions, environmental conditions, and emotional states would all be processed and reorganized during sleep, possibly influencing memory and future behavior. Some researchers continue to debate whether dreams serve primarily a functional cognitive role or whether they are simply the result of neural activity during reduced sensory input. While evidence supports several overlapping functions, no single explanation fully accounts for the richness and variability of dream experience. As you lie here, the idea of dreams becomes less like something separate from waking life and more like a continuation of it in a different form, a softer version of reality, where the mind is free to rearrange experience without constraint, and beneath that understanding, there is a quiet sense that your mind has always been doing this in some way, even when you are fully awake. Not always in images, but in associations, memories, and subtle emotional narratives that shape how you perceive the world. The room remains still, your body remains supported, and somewhere within the deeper layers of awareness, the dreaming mind continues its gentle preparation, weaving fragments of experience into patterns that only become clear in rest. You continue drifting, and the dreamlike quality of your thoughts lingers even as awareness remains lightly present. It is no longer clear where reflection ends and imagination begins. Everything feels gently woven together, as if your mind is preparing to step into something older than individual experience itself. Now you move into a quieter origin point of human cognition, storytelling around the fire before anything else. It helps to understand that spoken language was not just a communication tool, it was a survival system, a way to transfer knowledge, emotion, and social structure across generations. Long before writing existed, human memory depended heavily on oral storytelling to preserve information that could not be reliably stored in the environment. One widely accepted historical fact is that the earliest clear evidence of symbolic communication and structured language appears tens of thousands of years ago. Though spoken language itself is believed to be much older, this development allowed humans to share complex ideas, coordinate group behavior, and pass down knowledge in ways no other species achieves at the same scale. So as you rest here, it becomes easy to imagine how deeply storytelling is embedded in your own mind, not just as entertainment, but as a fundamental cognitive structure. Your thoughts often unfold in narrative form, even when you're not consciously telling a story. You might picture an early group gathered in dim firelight. The day's activities are finished. The environment outside is dark and uncertain. Inside the circle, someone begins to speak. Their voice carries information, memory, and meaning. Others listen not just for enjoyment, but for survival relevance. A lesser-known anthropological observation is that many early stories likely focused on practical knowledge embedded within narrative form. Information about animals, landscapes, dangers, and social behavior would have been transmitted through repeated storytelling, making it easier to remember and share accurately across time. It is easy to imagine how effective that would be. Instead of abstract instruction, knowledge becomes experience. Instead of lists of facts, there are characters, actions, and consequences. The mind remembers stories more easily than isolated information, which may explain why narrative remains such a powerful cognitive tool today. In many early human societies, storytelling was also a form of social cohesion. Shared narratives help define group identity, reinforce values, and maintain emotional connection. Listening together created alignment, not just of knowledge, but of attention and feeling. A quirky detail often mentioned in ethnographic studies is that some oral traditions used rhythm, repetition, and gesture to strengthen memory retention. These techniques were not formalized in the way modern education systems are, but they naturally enhanced recall and helped preserve information across generations. You might gently notice how your own mind responds to narrative structure even now. A sequence of events feels easier to follow than disconnected information. Emotional flow makes ideas more memorable. This is not coincidence. It reflects how deeply storytelling is built into cognitive architecture. Modern neuroscience suggests that the human brain is particularly attuned to narrative patterns because they mirror how experience is organized in memory. Events are not stored as isolated data points, but as sequences with emotional and contextual links. However, researchers still debate whether narrative cognition is primarily a biological adaptation or a cultural development that became reinforced over time. The discussion remains open. As you continue resting, you can imagine the fire slowly dimming as the story unfolds. Voices soften. Attention narrows into shared focus. The boundary between listener and story begins to blur, as if everyone present is briefly living inside the same mental space. There is also an interesting detail from cognitive archaeology. Some of the earliest symbolic artifacts may have functioned as prompts for memory or storytelling, helping to anchor oral traditions in physical objects. Stones, carvings, or arranged items may have served as reminders of events or narratives passed through generations. You might picture someone holding such an object while speaking, not as decoration, but as a link to memory, a way of keeping stories stable in a world where nothing else is permanently recorded. Scholars continue to explore whether storytelling emerged primarily as a tool for information transfer, or whether its emotional and social functions were equally important from the beginning. Some argue that survival utility drove its evolution, while others emphasize its role in bonding and shared identity. The evidence suggests that both aspects were deeply intertwined from early stages. As you lie here now, storytelling becomes less about language and more about structure itself. The mind naturally organizes experience into beginnings, developments, and quiet endings. Even your thoughts follow this rhythm without effort. In prehistoric settings, this structure would have been reinforced nightly through repetition and shared attention. Stories would have shaped not only memory, but also perception, helping individuals interpret future experiences based on past narratives. And in your present moment, that same system remains active. Every recollection, every anticipation, every imagined scenario is quietly influenced by the storytelling mind that evolved around ancient fires. The room remains calm, your breathing remains steady, and beneath all thought, the narrative system continues its gentle work, shaping experience into meaning even when no story is being told. You continue drifting, and now the sense of storytelling begins to dissolve into something even quieter, as if language itself is slowly becoming less important than the feeling behind it. The firelight you once imagined no longer feels like a scene. It feels more like a memory the mind never personally experienced, yet somehow understands. Now your awareness turns towards something softer, more subtle, and deeply human, comfort that feels a little strange. Before anything else, it helps to understand that comfort is not always interpreted by the brain as purely positive. Human biology evolved in environments where prolonged ease was rare, so the nervous system often associates complete stillness or sustained safety with unfamiliarity, especially when it contrasts sharply with older patterns of survival and activity. One well-established historical fact is that human physiology is adapted for cycles of activity and rest, shaped by environmental demands such as foraging, movement, and social coordination. Continuous comfort without variation is a relatively recent condition in evolutionary terms. So as you lie here now, in a safe, quiet, and stable environment, your body may still carry traces of older expectations. Rest is welcome, but unfamiliar levels of stillness can sometimes feel subtly unusual, as if something is missing even when nothing is wrong. You might notice this in small ways: a feeling that the mind wants to check something, a sense that there should be something to respond to. Not discomfort exactly, but a faint absence of urgency that the brain is still adjusting to. A lesser-known anthropological observation is that in many early human environments, periods of intense safety were often brief and followed by renewed activity, whether due to environmental change, resource movement, or group mobility. Long stretches of uninterrupted ease were less common than in modern life. It is easy to imagine that rhythm, moments of rest that are not separate from survival, but part of it, sitting after movement, eating after effort, sleeping after shared vigilance, comfort always paired with context, never entirely isolated. In that sense, your modern experience of comfort is unusual from an evolutionary perspective. It can exist for long periods without immediate demand or consequence. And the mind, shaped by older cycles, sometimes finds that continuity difficult to categorize. A quirky detail often mentioned in studies of human behavior is that people frequently introduce small forms of stimulation even during rest, such as shifting position, checking devices, or creating minor tasks. These actions may reflect an underlying tendency to maintain a balanced level of arousal rather than remaining in complete stillness for extended periods. You might gently recognize that tendency in subtle ways, not as action, but as impulse, a slight preference for movement over complete inactivity, a quiet sense that the mind enjoys gentle variation even in calm states. Modern neuroscience suggests that the brain operates within an optimal range of arousal, where both too much stimulation and too little can feel uncomfortable in different ways. This helps explain why absolute stillness can sometimes feel unfamiliar, even when it is safe. However, researchers still debate how much of this response is biologically fixed versus shaped by modern overstimulation patterns and lifestyle structure. As you continue resting, comfort itself begins to feel less like a destination and more like a state the mind gradually learns to accept. It does not need to be questioned or analysed. It simply exists, slowly becoming more familiar the longer it remains. There is also an interesting detail from comparative anthropology. Some early societies appear to have structured daily life around alternating periods of movement, social interaction, and rest in a more continuous rhythm than modern schedules. This created a flow where comfort was always contextual, never fully separated from activity or social engagement. You can imagine that gentle alternation now, not rigid scheduling, but natural shifts, energy rising and falling with environment, conversation, and need. Nothing held in a single fixed state for too long. Scholars continue to explore whether modern discomfort with stillness is primarily a biological inheritance or a response to cultural patterns that emphasize constant productivity and stimulation. Some argue that the human nervous system was never designed for prolonged inactivity without environmental feedback, while others suggest that adaptation to modern conditions is still ongoing. The discussion remains open across psychology and behavioral science. As you remain here, the feeling of comfort slowly begins to settle more deeply, not because anything changes externally, but because the mind gradually stops expecting change as a requirement for safety. And in that shift, something subtle happens. Comfort stops feeling unusual. It simply becomes the background. The room remains quiet. Your body remains supported, and beneath everything, the ancient rhythm of activity and rest continues its quiet presence, no longer asking for movement, only allowing stillness to exist without question. You continue drifting, and now even the idea of comfort begins to soften into something quieter, less defined, as if the mind no longer needs to evaluate experience at all. Everything that came before, fear, desire, belonging, vigilance, memory, anxiety, dreams, poreides, and even stillness itself, begins to settle into a single continuous background, not separate themes anymore, but layers of the same long human pattern. Now you arrive at the final gentle movement of this journey, returning to quiet sleep before anything else. It helps to understand that sleep is one of the oldest biological processes shared across nearly all mammals. It is not something humans invented or developed culturally. It is something inherited, refined, and preserved through millions of years of evolution. In sleep, the brain does not shut down. It reorganizes, processes, and restores itself. One well-established historical fact is that all known human societies have structured some form of sleep into daily life, even if the timing, duration, or cultural meaning of sleep varies widely. This suggests that rest is not optional for cognition, but essential for survival and mental stability. So as you lie here now, everything you have imagined across this journey begins to gently return to stillness. The prehistoric landscapes, the firelight, the cities, the fears, the desires, the stories, all of it slowly fades not as disappearance, but as integration, like waves returning to a larger ocean. You might notice how your breathing feels more natural now, not controlled, not observed, simply happening, the body settling into its own rhythm without instruction, the mind no longer needing to interpret every sensation or thought. A lesser-known observation from sleep research is that the transition into sleep often involves a gradual reduction in self-focused thinking. The sense of I am thinking begins to dissolve before awareness fully fades. This allows the brain to shift from active processing into restorative states more smoothly. It is easy to imagine that transition now, as a sudden break, but as a slow dimming, thoughts becoming less structured, images becoming less stable, awareness becoming less directed. A quirky detail often mentioned in chronobiology studies is that even in the absence of external cues, the human body maintains internal rhythms that influence sleep timing, temperature regulation, and hormonal cycles. These rhythms persist even in controlled environments, suggesting a deep biological foundation that does not rely on modern structures. You might gently feel that now, a sense of sinking, not downward, but inward, as if attention is no longer reaching outward to interpret anything, but simply resting where it is. Modern neuroscience continues to explore how consciousness transitions into sleep. Some researchers describe it as a gradual decoupling of attention from external awareness. Others emphasize the role of network reorganization within the brain. The exact boundary remains difficult to define, and perhaps that is part of what makes it feel so natural. There is no sharp edge, only a soft passage. Scholars continue to debate whether the subjective experience of falling asleep is primarily a passive process or an active one involving coordinated neural mechanisms. Some perspectives emphasize automaticity, while others highlight subtle regulatory processes that guide the transition. The discussion remains open, but all agree that sleep is fundamental to human function. As you rest here now, there is nothing left to follow, no ideas to explore, no environments to imagine, no system to understand. Only the quiet presence of being at rest, carried by a process that has existed far longer than thought itself. The room around you remains still. The world beyond it continues without urgency. And beneath everything, your mind begins its gentle descent into deeper rest, returning to a state that does not require awareness to function, only trust in the rhythm that has always been there, and slowly, even this awareness becomes softer, lighter, more distant, until it no longer needs to be held at all. You are still here, resting quietly, as the last traces of thought begin to slow down even further. There is nothing left to understand, nothing left to follow, and nowhere your mind needs to go next. Everything has already unfolded gently, like a long path walked in soft evening light, and now that path simply comes to rest. In this stillness, even the idea of time begins to loosen. It no longer feels divided into moments or sections. It becomes something smoother, like breath moving in and out without effort. You do not need to guide it. You do not need to hold it. It continues on its own, steady and calm. If there are any remaining images in your mind, they begin to fade at the edges first, not disappearing suddenly, but dissolving fully, like distant landscapes seen through mist. Firelight becomes softer, voices become quieter, movement becomes less defined until it is no longer something you're observing, only something gently remembered. Your body remains supported exactly where it is. There is no requirement to adjust anything, no decision to make, no direction to follow. Even awareness itself feels like it is becoming lighter, less attached, more distant, as if it is slowly setting down a weight it no longer needs to carry. And in this gradual release, something very simple remains, a sense of being here. Without effort, without expectation, without needing to interpret the world or prepare for it. Just presence, soft and unresisting, like calm water settling after movement has passed. The ancient rhythms that once shaped survival, attention, memory, and imagination are still there, but now they no longer speak loudly. They do not need to. They are simply part of what you are, quietly resting beneath everything else. And as you continue to drift, even these words begin to lose their shape, becoming less like language and more like silence returning. You are safe, you are still, and you can let go a little more with every passing moment. Sweet dreams.